Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a review for You Were Here by Cori McCarthy, illustrated by Sonia Liao. This is a young adult contemporary novel about a teenage girl whose older brother died doing daredevil stunts. The book follows her in her grief as well as her group of 5 friends, as they, in a way, follow in her brother's footsteps in order to feel closer to him and deal with the pressures of graduating from high school and the changes that come from that. I gave this book 3 stars. I kind of went into this expecting it to be like a really easy 4-star read because it is a topic that I was very interested in, and I read the first chapter and her writing style was absolutely wonderful. But as the book went along, there just kept being more and more issues that I had difficulty with. The bulk of this review is going to be on the characters and their perspectives because that was honestly where I had the most issues, but also where I enjoyed the book the most. There are 5 characters in this. JC, who's the main character, her former best friend Natalie, Natalie's boyfriend, Mick, who was one of JC's older brother's friends, and Bishop, who's just a casual friend of the whole group. JC was the main character, and I do think, above all else, this is her book. It's told in 5 perspectives, so each of those characters does get their own chapter, but in books like this, you can tell who's the crux of the story, and in this was definitely JC. JC's perspective is in first person, and that was honestly one of the perspectives I enjoyed the most in this story. It just flowed very naturally, and it felt right. I was very interested in JC's storytelling, and I think if it had been told entirely from JC's perspective, there's a solid chance this would have been a 4-star read for me, but it wasn't. There are 4 other perspectives that both have the most positive aspects of this book and the least positive. The second 2 that are easy to talk about are Natalie and Natalie's boyfriend. Both of their perspectives are in third person, and that was one of my earliest issues in this book, was that I didn't notice that initially. So whenever it switched perspective from JC's first person over to Natalie and her boyfriend's third person, I found it very confusing, and I didn't notice it was in first, so I would forget who the main character of that chapter was. I'd forget whose thoughts we were in. And it was very jarring. I've read books that do the switch between first and third well. It's never something that's a favorite for me, but it can be fine. In this, it didn't make sense. It just kind of felt wrong to my head. I don't know why, but I could never fully wrap my mind around it, and it just never felt like it worked very well. The 4th perspective in this is Bishop, who's a casual friend. I think he's meant to be Natalie's boyfriend's best friend, which is pretty much his role in the story. His perspective is told through word art. That's why I mentioned the illustrator for this book is Sonia Liao. I didn't like Bishop's perspective. I didn't like that it was told through word art, first of all. That felt gimmicky to me in this book. It didn't feel like it contributed anything. It didn't feel like it made sense for the character. Like, he was a poet, he did do graffiti, but it never felt like it added to the story. But even more than that, Bishop as a whole character didn't feel like he contributed anything to the story. He just didn't make sense. If he'd been removed from the story entirely, I don't think anything would have changed. He never had an arc of his own, where the other 4 characters in this book definitely had an arc and were definitely very intertwined. Bishop just sort of felt extra, and I really didn't like his inclusion. I thought 5 characters was way too many for this book, and it just felt sort of messy and like it was too much, and I do think part of that was because of Bishop. I would just forget who he was, and I could never figure out why he was written in this book. The 5th perspective in this is Mick. He was JC's older brother's friend. Everything I felt about Bishop and his sections and his character is pretty much opposite when it comes to Mick. Mick's sections were told through comic strips. I thought the word art for Bishop was very gimmicky. It didn't feel like it worked within the story. But I felt Mick's comic strips were beautifully done. That was my favorite part of the story, and I'm not someone who really gravitates towards graphic novels or comic books. That's just not something that interests me. But in this, it felt like his comic strips really pushed the narrative forward. They made sense within the story and within the context of his character. He's a selective mute. He does talk. He talks regularly, but he doesn't like to, and he does feel very anxious and uncomfortable when talking in certain situations. So I felt like the use of comic strips for him was a really wonderful way to include that in his character, and I thought it was so well done, and I just adored that. That was my favorite part of this book by far. I feel like had this been JC and Mick's story instead of a story for all 5 of them, I would have enjoyed this a lot better. It was just too much with all five of the perspectives, and I couldn't get into it. Overall, the story itself felt very flat and formulaic to me, and I think a big part of that is because JC found her older brother's notebook, and they decided to go through and explore all of the places he had explored because he was very into urban exploring as well as daredevil stunts. So because they were just following essentially a map that he had laid out for them, it did feel very formulaic to me. I think if you're someone who enjoys that kind of story where the characters are working off a list or working off instructions or anything like that, you probably wouldn't have an issue with that. I just don't tend to like that narrative in books. When it's a scavenger hunt kind of story, it does come across to me like they're just following a script, which makes it not flow quite as naturally. But again, if that doesn't bother you in books most of the time, it probably won't here. That's just something I'm less interested in. Just in general, I found that as time went on reading this book, I was less and less interested. This is a book that I would honestly pick up and read in a day or two. It's a YA contemporary, it's very issue driven, it's about grief. This is a 1 or 2 sitting read. I just fly through books like this, and I think this took me 5 days to get through. And I kept falling asleep while reading this book. At first, I thought it was because I was reading it at night, and I would just be tired and have to go through and reread passages over and over again because I would just not pay attention. But then I started reading it during the day and nothing really changed. I just wasn't interested. I couldn't bring myself to focus on this book because there was nothing I was really invested in. It became more about the romance and the relationships between the characters than it was about the grief. And I do really enjoy romance in books, and I thought part of it was well done in this. I just wish it hadn't been quite the focus of the plot. And overall, I didn't hate this book. I'm fine that I read it. It's one of those books that's going to fade very quickly. I don't think I will remember this book in another couple of months. It was just a mediocre 3-star, a mediocre contemporary YA. I think if it's the kind of thing that sounds interesting to you and you feel like you do better with multiple perspectives, if you like the idea of word art in comic books in this, and you like the idea of like a sort of scavenger hunt that they're going on, you might enjoy this a lot more than I did. It was just a lot of things. It was just a lot of story elements that I tend to feel are a little bit lazy and I don't tend to like as much, all mixed together and just made this kind of a mediocre read. Which is disappointing because I had decent expectations for this book and I was excited to get into it. Let me know down below if you've read You Were Here and what you thought of it if you have, because I was kind of torn on this book and just very disappointed at the end because I did expect a lot better. As always, thank you guys so much for watching and I'll see y'all again soon.